Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Josh from Parking Logix, and today we're going to be discussing gateless digital parking environments with occupancy systems with our close friends at Premium Parking. Today, we're just going to go through a quick little agenda here. We're going to do introductions to your hosts, myself, Josh, and Ben Montgomery from Premium Parking. We're then getting an update on the gateless parking environments and trends and what's going on there. The same with parking occupancy systems and guidance systems. And then finally, we're going to bring it together and show how these technologies can work together to provide enormous value to end clients. And finally, leaving some room for some questions and answers at the end. During the webinar, you are able to type in a question into the questions box that's there. And if there's time at the end of the presentation, we'll go through and try to answer some. Otherwise, contact information will be provided at the end to follow up with any questions. And so with you guys, or leading you guys today, is a little, first myself. I'm the president of Parking Logix, Josh Eisen. I've been with the firm and a founding member for about 7 years. And Parking Logix is a provider of parking occupancy systems, where we count cars in and out of facilities across nearly 10 or 12 different verticals. We're in 7 countries with over 650 lots now using our counting technology. And an introduction to our good friend, Ben, please introduce yourself.
Hey, Josh, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Ben Montgomery. I'm the president of Premium Parking. Premium Parking is a parking solutions provider focused specifically on what we call gateless digital parking. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're currently in about 50 markets and operate 450 plus locations with a great team. We do everything from management to actually build the software. So we call it a full stack parking platform and solutions provider. So thank you and Josh and the rest of the Parking Logix team for organizing this, and we see a good list of folks on the call. We look forward to talking a little bit more about gateless and occupancy.
All right, well, why don't you start off and tell us a little bit, what is this whole gateless thing that you guys are talking about, and tell us about it.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to start by just making sure we're on the same page and are talking about what we define as gateless parking and what I think the industry's probably always defined, but sometimes people get a little bit confused at what we mean. And what I've found historically, the easiest way to get people into the right sort of framework around what the workflows are associated with gateless is simply to say it's on-street parking, right? You pull into a parking space, you see a sign that tells you what you can do or should do or cannot do. You pay for parking or follow the instructions, and if you don't, something bad happens. So it's an enforcement model, okay, for parking, and that's really what we're talking about in gateless parking. When we talk about gateless digital parking, it's now sort of leveraging this sort of digital world to make those systems work better, and then obviously we've moved to the license plate as the primary credential. So what we've done at Premium is taken that old on-street small parking lot model of no gates, pay before enforcement model, and brought it to much larger and more complex environments with a focus on what we call people, places, platform, where all of those things need to work together. And one of the things that we've noticed as we've worked with clients is that there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And so when we think about gateless parking, what we want to talk about is kind of what are we using in all these different pieces of the parking puzzle, if you will. So what is the underlying system that we're using to program rates, program policy, record data, essentially the park system to manage the operation. There's obviously a lot of different payment options now. So that could be a natively installed app. It could be a QR code based workflow or a text pay based workflow, or it could be a prepaid reservation through an aggregator. And so you have this sort of whole world of payments that you've got to piece together when you get into this gateless world. Validations it's a different thing when you start to operate in gateless. When you're in a gated traditional parks world, the payment is at the end, right? You pull in, you pull a ticket, you drive through the gate, you go to the end, and then you maybe get a chaser ticket, or your ticket gets scanned and validated, and you pay at the end. So there's a whole sort of new set of workflows that come in when you need to introduce validations. Obviously, permits and monthly parking are really great because they're done virtually. There's no physical credential that needs to be distributed. The credential's already on the vehicle in the license plate. There's a whole enforcement stack, whether it's manual enforcement, mobile LPR, or fixed LPR. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the trends. And then the digital part of the gateless digital parking is all about sort of this: how do you make those digital endpoints, the Google Maps, Waze, a searchable website, the venues that your facility is associated with, available online to market and make people aware of where the parking is, and also communicate some of the occupancy information through those channels. And then the last is pulling it all together in some sort of data analytics platform. So when we talk about gateless, everybody think on-street parking operation, but in much more complex, large parking garages and town centers, things like that. And then these are kind of the pieces of the puzzle that we're talking about.
So why do you think the gateless market is growing? Like, what are the sort of the key demand factors that you're seeing to the adoption of the tech?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of growth. I look at the numbers. Again, this is our primary focus. We were running 249 locations coming into COVID, and as of today, we're up over 450. And so the market is seeing that this is a very, very viable solution. And again, the way that I think about it is this is really an old school way of running parking. If you think about it, we've all the operators on the call, all the institutions that run their parking probably have run at some point a gateless parking operation. What's changed, though, is that type of operation at scale is starting to make more and more sense. And the reason for that is because the world has changed. And the things that I've seen that have changed the underlying conditions that we kind of live in is, one, obviously mobile transactions. We're using our phones. Most people have a smartphone now. We're using it to buy coffee. We're using it to book travel. We're using it to hail a cab. We're using it for all sorts of transactions. The other is cloud infrastructure. And one of the things I tell folks when we talk about what we've done is Premium didn't have to focus on how to create a distributed server network or a global payments platform or a global text communication platform. They're wonderful underlying cloud infrastructure services like Stripe and Twilio and AWS that provide that, which allows us to focus on the specific user interfaces and workflows that are important for the parking industry. And so that the maturation of that cloud infrastructure has been absolutely critical to making these systems work better. And then the last is machine learning. And if you've certainly, most of the people on this call have noticed that LPR technology, which is using probably one of the most most advanced technologies that have come out of machine learning, which is sort of this ability to recognize images. And that in our industry has shown up in the ability to easily scan a license plate and understand whether it's properly credentialed for where it is. And so when you start to see all of that, one of the things that we've figured out is that you can get much better compliance than you had traditionally seen in these small parking lots and these on-street operations. When you start to make it easier to pay, when you've got better
convenience drives compliance, is what you're saying.
Yeah, when we talk about compliance, we talk about the 3 E's of compliance. And the first is the ease of it. How easy is it to comply? Is the signage clear? Are the workflows easy, right? The next is education. So I always say nobody's pulling into a parking lot to park, maybe if you're tailgating, but most people are parking and they're going somewhere. And so engaging and educating those stakeholders downstream of the transaction to make sure it's working for their constituents is absolutely critical. And then the last piece actually is enforcement. And so we've seen, as we've taken this into larger operations, the compliance, and we get tons and tons of data on how many people are actually violators in these facilities. And in these large garages, we've seen 98.5, 99.5% compliance. And so that sort of changes your thinking around putting gates in. And one way to think about it is when you put a gate in, every single parker gets stuck by, has to go through that gate. So they have to pause entering or exiting the facility. They've also got it's a dependent system, so they have to wait on the person in front of them. And so what it allows us to do is add more value for call it the 99 parkers out of 100. And maybe you don't worry as much about the 1%. And so what we've seen, which really ultimately driving growth, is, okay, show me how this impacts my operation. And in parking and in most businesses, what we're looking at is really 3 ways to positively impact the parking operations. One is sort of, again, that free flow, that predictability that you get when you take gates out. So the customer service, the customer experience, can we lift up the quality of that? The second is eliminating or greatly reducing CapEx costs and ongoing OpEx costs. And then there actually are ways, and we have generally seen, where you're able to drive additional revenue. And we can talk a little bit about that in some of the trends as we get to the next set of slides here. And so what I want to do quickly, and we want to kind of keep this moving so we've got good time for Q&A at the end, is just talk about some of the trends that we're seeing around this gateless parking model. And the first is something that we really pioneered just because we had a lot of tourists in the French Quarter that didn't want to download our parking app. And so we said, I wonder if there's a way that we could get them to use their phone, because they can then up their time and they can get alerts and all the positive things you get when you use an app to pay for parking, but without having to download an app and without having to have set up an account in advance. And so we were the first to launch we call it an appless guest transaction, and we did it with TextPay. And what's interesting is that I used to kind of, our developers and our product team would come to me and say, hey, we got to do something around QR code. I'd say, well, when was the last time you used a QR code? And they would say, they kind of give me this blank stare. I said, listen, you're on the cutting edge of technology and you're not using them. The general population's not using them. Well, 2 things changed. One happened right before COVID, and one happened during COVID. The first was both Apple and Android built QR code scanning natively into the camera apps on the phone. So you didn't have to download a special app to scan a QR code. And the second is every waiter and waitress in this country taught people how to use QR codes because they were using it for their menus. And so we have seen a massive 700% growth in people paying through the camera pay channel. And so this is a huge trend where over 50% of the transactions that happen on a mobile phone in premium parking are not happening on a natively installed app. It's an appless transaction. The other thing that we're seeing, go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say, it's crazy, and it's so much simpler in that way, because then, especially also for visitors, right? So if you're dealing with like a beach access, someone coming from another city, maybe they have a local mobile payment phone provider there. Maybe it's a Passport, Park Mobile, Pay by Phone. But in this territory that doesn't apply, it won't matter. They just take a picture right with a QR code.
Exactly. You get this sort of, it's all about the customer, right? At the end of the day, it's all about that ease of use, which drives your compliance. If you make it easier for them to pay, they pay at a higher rate. And so, again, that appless is all about not having to go to the App Store, search for an app, download it, set up an account, then pay for parking. Go to the next slide real quick, Josh. So the other thing, and this is a little bit also around this ease, is that there's a lot of payment apps out there. And so you're starting to see, and this is something I think that's been talked about in the industry for a long time, but you're starting to see what we call sort of multi-channel mobile payment, right? And so and this sort of emergence of a platform of record. So you might engage with a Glide Parks and a Premium to be the platform of record, but that doesn't mean that you have to stop accepting, the app that's maybe in the nearby city. And so this is a project that we've got going on the streets in Memphis with Park Mobile. And so Glide Parks is the platform of record. They're using us for the enforcement, but they're able to accept either the Park Mobile app, the Premium app, and then obviously the appless transactions that Premium is able to offer as well. The next trend I want to talk about, it's an interesting one, Josh, next slide, is one of the things I find a lot when I talk about gateless is people like, oh, LPR cameras, mobile LPR. That's not a prerequisite. And I often advise clients, hey, let's just go gateless. We can use the enforcement app that we have, and you can have an agent go through and scan the plates, and let's see what compliance we have. And then you can see if it makes sense to do a mobile LPR strategy or a fixed LPR strategy. But one of the things that's making the fixed LPR, especially in larger facilities, pretty exciting, we launched a product called GlideEye. And what GlideEye does is it's a fixed LPR camera. And I'll be honest, I still believe in boots on the ground enforcement. You get incredible value from having somebody walk through your facility, provide customer service, look for trash and lights that are out or people that shouldn't be in the facility. So there's incredible value there, but they're not there all the time. And so what GlideEye does is it allows for the system to recognize a violator that wasn't caught through manual enforcement and obviously didn't pay or credential, and then it'll actually do a DMV lookup and mail a citation to their house. And so that's been a very exciting thing. And we've rolled this out at about 50 of our locations now, and we're seeing some great returns in growing compliance for our clients. The last one, and this kind of gets into some of the value add that you get when you go gateless. And there's sort of a big sort of idea I want to talk about, and then I'll get to this sort of specific use case of EV charging spaces. But the big sort of idea is that if you have a garage and it's gated, every spot on the other side of the gates has the same policy because the policy effectively lives in the gate. When you go gateless, a bunch of different things can determine policy. How you sold your monthly parking or permit to the person, the signage that you have, the information you communicated through the purchase process. And so all of a sudden, you can start to think much more creatively, I call it geographically, within your facilities about how you set policy, how you set rate, and how you allocate spaces. And so one of the byproducts of that, which is obviously a massive trend we're seeing with the stock price of Tesla, the announcement of the Ford F-150, we are going to need to build out quite a bit of EV charging infrastructure in this country. And the question is, how do we pay for it? How do we do the transactions? And one of the things we figured out, we were doing these star spaces, and we figured out we could do the same thing with EV charging. So it's one transaction. It's a higher rate structure that accounts for the added amenity of being able to charge your vehicle in the space, and that helps pay for, obviously, the infrastructure that's needed to provide that service. And so you can kind of leverage that ability to do geographic pricing within your facility to start to create a strategy around EV charging. So those are the trends: appless, multi-channel platform of record, and then these LPR cameras with auto citations built into them. And then the last is sort of this growing need for infrastructure and a strategy for transactions around EV charging. So Josh, thanks for letting me update everybody on gateless parking. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And so the reason why also this is actually a perfectly complementary technology is that traditionally, especially in gated environments, many people are getting occupancy information from the gates. Maybe it's from gate actuations or from the counts and the loops in the ground. But once you go gateless, you lose that occupancy statistic. You lose that data feed and that understanding. So this is where we come in to say is we can add in parking counting or occupancy technology into a gateless environment to provide that kind of missing data feed there that you get when your loops are gone. But what I want to do is just start off and say, really, what is this occupancy technology and how we view it at Parking Logix? When we think about parking guidance systems, whether it's green and red lights, cameras monitoring spaces, or what's out there, in the end, it's best really to segment it into two things. And the way we think about it is that it's, on one end, it's a communication platform in the sense of updating drivers or parkers where spaces are available so they can make the best travel decision. But at the same time, for the asset owners who employ the occupancy system, It's a source of valuable data to help for decision-making and operations and for planning. So we sort of look at these things as, why do people buy these guidance systems or occupancy systems to start? So most of the time when we approach clients, many are interested simply to reduce the stress and frustration associated with finding a spot. So this is universal amongst off-street facilities because getting people to spaces faster is a lovely thing, and it's adopted across many different industries for that purpose. But when you start to get into portfolio assets or people with many lots, you find that this occupancy information actually assists in the utilization of these assets. So long story short, you might have two lots that are across the street from each other, but one is closer to an administrative building at school or maybe a gym at a university. So normally you would have 100 spaces in either lot across the street. But the thing is that you have 50 extra cars in the lot waiting for people to back out of spaces on the close lot, and the one across the street is sitting half empty. By indicating to drivers where these spaces are available, the right spots get filled up and you don't get 50 extra cars in lots. And it basically spreads out the traffic. And then operationally, you can get alerts from the system when your lot is full. Maybe you want to put out an A-frame. Maybe you want to close off the gates. Maybe you want to do other things in terms of responding to when the lot is full. But having an occupancy system in a gateless environment can still alert your staff as to what they would want to do for decisions. And finally, I can't remember anyone enjoying doing car counts at 3 o'clock in the morning. And an occupancy system is a great way to not have to worry about car counts, especially when it comes to enforcement or looking at compliance. But the big thing is called what we call is like you have your 3 E's. We call it look at our 4 P's of what people are doing with this occupancy information. So planning. Do you need to build more spaces or less spaces? Understanding what your occupancy is really is a great determinant of what that demand based on pricing and other things. But really you could see is, do I need to build 100 more spaces? Do I not? Can I remove some of these spaces and make room for other things? So I'm working with asset owners with large retail footprints and are saying is my lots are never used over 60 or 70% capacity. Can I convert this extra space now into more development? Can I put more hard goods on it? Can I use a better use for it? So that's kind of what our systems help do. And for pricing, everyone thinks about dynamic pricing, whether it is based on occupancy. So having a separate or a built-in occupancy system can also help within a gateless environment determine what that optimal rate structure is going to be without the presence of loops. I have hundreds of university sites that are using our technology for permit planning. How many permits do I need to sell for any given lot? You might not have gates, you might have hang tags, you might have whatever in terms of your control, but how do you know how many permits to sell? What is your oversell percentage? The occupancy stat is key for that. And so our kind of systems don't need to be embedded in parks and can sit in a gateless environment. And finally, productivity. When do you need to bring in that extra valet guy, or when do you want to do striping or cleaning? Knowing who's coming in and when can help you plan better. So that's kind of the way we look. And so everyone has many, taking a step back, there's 1,000 different ways to count cars, from cameras to individual space sensors, to loops, to even pneumatic tubes. The way that we've been successful over the past few years is using ingress and egress sensors that are wireless, that are put on the ground that speak to signs. So there's no local power needed because they can be solar powered, and no local data required because everything works on the cellular network. We're simply in a large surface environment, we can drill down a few rubber pods, put in a sensor, and it counts. So here's a quick example of where we did a shopping center in California that had 6,500 spaces. So if you were to put single space sensors everywhere or cameras everywhere, the project would cost over $1 million. It's just that many spaces and time. We just outfitted about 130 entry and exit lanes with small data collectors around, and cars just drive in and out, and we got a count for 85% less cost. So it's our focus on doing simplicity, in this case, just for data, when in other cases, it's more for guidance. So at a simple university environment, we put up a solar powered sign. There's a rubber hump you can see on the left-hand side where we have an embedded sensors. Cars drive in, they drive out, it shows the occupancy, and it's also on an app as well. And some schools are using our stuff for game days. So you have a gateless environment, right? Because you don't want to have gates come blocking in a few thousand people in 5 minutes, but you still want to get a count. So you could say the lot's full and direct traffic otherwise. So we have many partners using our stuff on game days in order to drive traffic. And then, and actually what's nice is that in the garage settings, like what you've seen, Ben, is that we're now putting our sensors on the ground in between levels to count cars as they traverse between level 1, level 2, or one area and another area. And the entire thing is wireless, so we're not running cable and conduit from every detection point. So the cost of installation and the time of installation is literally 30% of single space systems. And one of the biggest part of our communication plan is signs, telling people where spaces are, whether it's on different levels, or maybe in an environment like you see here that we did with the university, we're showing people where spaces are on 3 different lots so they make that better decision before they go in. Where's there going to be a space for me? While at the same time, we have infrastructureless signage solutions just outside the lot showing where the spaces are free. But this is actually where there's some great overlap, especially with things like charging stations and ADA. So very recently, we've acquired the capabilities of providing single space sensors, but rather than for every space, for the few spaces that may matter. So if you have a hospital environment, which we have several, you might have 1,000 spaces, but maybe you actually have 30 or 40 ADA spaces that normally I wouldn't be able to differentiate. So now I'm working with clients to just put the single space sensors, because maybe you want to take out the count of the ADA spaces when you're looking at your overall potential population. And so what this offers is the ability to do your general ingress egress count when that matters. But if you want maybe your charging stations, this is something that we can do as well. So here's an example of technology that we've done at Heathrow Airport in the UK, where we have flush vented sensors for cars that park there. And what we find with the EV charging stations, which is unique, is that the charging stations simply know whether or not a car is charging or not, but they don't know whether or not the space is actually in use. So if you have a car that might be parked there and not charging, it's using up that space. But if that charging station is online, it would show that that station is available for someone to use, even though that space is actually being occupied. So just using a few sensors in this kind of way allows you to enforce it better, allows you to track the actual space utilization better too. So, do I need to buy 5 more charging stations, or do I just actually need to enforce it a little bit better, and maybe I don't need 5 more? So it's just knowing a little bit more. And then I think, Ben, I think for you to take over, why don't you share a little bit of project that we did in Biddeford?
Yeah, I wanted to just first say that the way that we got introduced to Parking Logix was, I was scouring the internet like I do, reading about parking technology, and what really made us so interested, and then as we got to know them, ultimately choose them to work with, was the ease of installing and sort of the cost structure that they had for it, for their system, and then the fact that they had an API. And I didn't mention that, but I think that can kind of fit into that multi-channel platform of record. I think sort of software talking to software is a major trend, not just in parking, obviously, but in the tech world in general. And so we've done a number of projects now. The most recent one we just launched at the beginning of this month up in Biddeford, Maine. It's a new garage, and you can see, if you go, I think, to the next slide, Josh, you can see that it's literally just opening. And the whole goal here is that this garage sort of sits at the, the entrance. It's a large garage, and so we are not. One of the things you lose when we don't have the gates is that this is a very heavy monthly utilized garage, and so one of the things you lose with that is that ability to know when your monthlies are coming and going, right? Because it's sort of, they have their license plate in the system, and as long as they're going at the times that they're valid, they can come and go as they please. And so, the ability to really track how many vehicles are in that garage when you have a large mix of monthlies, and then communicate at the front end to the parkers is incredibly valuable from a time saving standpoint, because they could see that obviously this garage, hopefully we manage it so it's about 95% occupied. But if it is full, there's some additional spaces on past it, and they could save the time of obviously circulating throughout the garage. So this has been an exciting project. It just opened. And the other thing that we really like, so one is this sort of, obviously the communication. And one thing I do want to say about that, we talk to lots of clients that look at how do we count occupancy, how do we communicate occupancy. And one of the other things I like is that their system scales up. They're not trying to sell me something that's for every single space in the garage. It's incredibly expensive. Really, we can do some very easy equipment installations, and all of a sudden we get very, very rich data. And the most valuable data is first that whole occupancy number. In other words, should I waste my time pulling into this facility? And then the next, like Josh mentioned, is the ability to communicate by floor. And so the other thing that we're able to do is capture that data into our system. And so we're using that. If you go to our website and our apps, you'll see we use this red light, green light, or green light, yellow light. And so we actually are feeding, I think it's every 10 minutes that we suck in the space count from Parking Logix system into Glide Parks. And we provide that in dashboards. We also provide it into the consumer-facing websites and apps. And so it's been a great partnership. We're actually really excited about some of the per space counting abilities for reserve spaces, EV charging spaces, and star spaces that we do. But it's been a great partnership, and again, adds a whole nother level of understanding to our gateless operations. So it's been
for sure. No, thanks, Ben. And look, it's been a great project, obviously, a small, simple one, but to be honest, they're just as valuable to us as even the larger ones. And even building upon that monthly parking, one of these values that we're seeing is when you look at corporate campuses or for these employees, actually getting them into spaces faster in a gateless environment will save them time. Meaning is that they're not looking for spaces, they're trying to find a place to park for 10 or 15 minutes every day. And if you multiply that amongst hundreds of employees, it actually leads to huge losses of labor productivity. And we have several clients that we work with that are like, I just want to get my staff in sooner and faster because them wasting 50 minutes to find a space and getting in is costing me money. And it also costs like traffic stuff in between. But I believe we have a few questions, Ryan, that you've collected.
Gosh,
so
I want to just riff on that. It's funny. We're solving the same problem. When you think of, an office building with 800 spaces, the amount of, when you're going in and out every single day, the amount of productivity that can be saved or lost by speeding up the ability to, get into that facility, get into your space. It really, really adds up for the companies, the institutions, and the economy in general. So I love how you put that.
Yeah, it's a big savings and making it easy as well. Ryan, are you there?
I'm here. All right. So here are some questions that have come in. Does gateless mean cashless?
So no, gateless doesn't necessarily mean cashless. Though you are seeing, one of the trends that I would say has been going on for quite some time is obviously the movement away from cash. But our system, Glide Parks, is integrated with a number of different pay machine companies, and those machines accept cash. The other thing we've seen a little bit of, as some of the municipalities have looked to move their on-street and try to still provide a solution for people that are still in a cash economy, is the ability to partner through validations and have nearby merchants actually sell the parking using cash. So definitely not cashless.
Right, but it's interesting. So a few hundred moons ago, I used to be an operator, but in Canada, the acceptance of credit card payments, we were at 85, 90% 15 years ago, where the States was slow there. But then with mobile payment companies and stuff actually growing like crazy in the States, then credit card acceptance went up. And I just wondered now, it's like versus your revenues 10 years ago, what percentage is credit card now versus before? And I imagine it's night and day.
Oh yeah, you're up over 95%, credit card or debit card or wallet or, something, obviously. Yeah, not cash. And we're also pulling the pay machines off. I mean, you're seeing, more and more equipmentless operations. I think we've got about 100, or not, probably not 100, probably, yeah, maybe 100 now of our facilities that literally just have signage up. It's only signage, and it's all a virtual platform.
Oh, so your setup costs are like 2 days of painting, putting up new signs, and there you go. There's your new park system.
Yep, exactly.
Great.
Following that question is how will you ensure that you will collect the fee in a gateless parking environment?
So it's an enforcement model, right? So you will have violators, right? I think that is a given. I think that if anybody's operated a park system, they know that a gated system likely is not collecting all of the parking either. And so really what you're trying to do is get an understanding, and you've got a whole bunch of different levers you can pull in that sort of 3 E's, the ease, the education, and the enforcement to drive that compliance. And so what typically you see is that on an on-street, you see worse compliance. On a small parking lot, you see a little bit better. But as you get into the garages and these larger operations, you see better and better compliance. And a lot of that is driven, and I'm not going to try to eat up all the time, but there's an equation that we think about. And basically what you're trying to do is make the cost of paying for parking cheaper than the cost of not paying for parking. And there's a bunch of variables that go into that, but you have a lot of control over that, and you'll be amazed the amount of compliance that you can drive. So the answer is you will not have everybody pay, but you'll have the vast majority. And the kind of back to that value creation, the amount of value created by delivering a frictionless system to the vast majority of parkers, you can actually extract more value out of that than you lose by the people that may try to cheat the system.
Yeah. And you know what? It's like by doing the cashless, there were also other problems before. Not that many people still have people in gates or, in booths anymore. I know that's sort of, dying out now. But before, I remember batch processing credit cards, right? So you'd wait till the end of the day. You may have had, 15%, well, probably not 15, but an X% of cars that had left, but they had bad credit cards, but you didn't know till you batched them that night. But now everything is, call it in real time. So I imagine the 95% that you do collect in credit cards is 95 right there in the bank versus before or other situations that there is cash. So having you're reducing your lossage, your shrinkage, huge.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen that, and that's true, I would say, across gateless and gated, where you've just seen, because so much has moved to the credit card, the shrinkage has been reduced significantly. But again, I think where we've seen the revenue growth is really just on the ability to better serve the customer, and you'll be amazed at how much a little bit better service, a little bit more frictionless operations can generate value.
For sure.
So I just want to just make a quick note to the attendees. We're getting a lot of questions. We will get through them all. The next question is, how do you keep people out of a gateless environment or a gateless garage?
Yeah, that's one of the first, and I think that's tied into this occupancy discussion, right? How do you manage the occupancy if you're worried about your facility filling? And what because I'm usually selling against gates, right? We think we're really, really good at gateless, and so most of the discussion is us selling against gates. If somebody's gone gateless, it's a much easier sale for us. And so what I usually ask them is, well, what do you do now with your gated system? And what they typically say is they'll put a sign out that says something like permit parking only, or permit and visitor parking only. And that obviously tamps down some of the transient demand that would go in there, and hopefully that balances the occupancy for the day. And then I said, well, what if that doesn't work? And they said, well, then we may have to put somebody out there. And it would be surprising how many things that they do before they say, I actually turn off the ticket spinner in my gated system. And the reality is we just do all the same things, right? The same thing happens. When you have a gateless facility, you put a sign out that says, no transient parking right now, which tamps down the demand. But the one thing you can do in a gateless as opposed to a gated, I mean, think about if you have a gate up a ramp and you decide to turn off the ticket spitter, somebody ignores your signage, they pull up there, now they're stuck, now 3 more monthlies pull in behind them. That's a real problem. In a gateless environment, you can turn off all of the ability to credential on a transient basis, and then you can actually communicate in the software that, hey, the reason you can't buy this is because of this, and oh, by the way, the nearby facility that we would like you to park in is over here. And so again, the difference in how you manage that occupancy really on sort of a day-to-day basis is very, very similar to the gate environment, with sort of one added benefit. The other thing I tell you is that the data is really important. And so one of the things that we're able to do is we can leverage the occupancy that we're getting from the parking Logix system. We can leverage the transaction data that we're getting to create real-time alerts that get pushed to operations to tell them like things like, hey, maybe you do need to put the sign out today. We've had 50% more transient transactions by 9 a.m. than we typically do at a facility. And so there's a lot of ability to do that. Obviously, rate structures and things like that, there's sort of infinite possibilities around.
It's funny. I just got a comment that someone texted me from our friends at University of Delaware that they actually see 95% compliance amongst their university parkers.
Yeah.
So that's huge.
Just riding on the question wave here. Another question around gateless environments. Do you lose safety when you take out the gates?
Yeah, great. Again, they're hitting on all the very common objections and questions. And so I actually don't think you do. We think, and I mentioned this when I was talking about the LPR trend, fixed LPR trend. I'm a big believer in boots on the ground enforcement. I think that there's, you're not doing it 24/7, but having somebody going through those facilities, adds something to the quality of that operation in the long term. And so we actually think that you increase the safety presence, because the reality is one, a gate arm does not stop a pedestrian that shouldn't be in your facility from getting into your facility. And two, it doesn't stop a vehicle because it can pull a ticket. But what doesn't happen in a gated facility is that there's no sort of natural part of the operation where there's somebody walking through your facility. Realize we're getting data literally every second on where those enforcement agents are and how they're progressing through those garages as they scan plates. And so you've got great accountability on the safety presence that's in your facilities and around your facilities. And I think that actually adds to the overall sort of safety and sort of customer service as well of the facility, as opposed to having a remote monitoring system or somebody in a booth or an office at the front of the facility.
Awesome.
I would also say is just leaving a lot without having to stop and pay in lane is just so much simpler and faster and safer. You know what I mean? You keep your windows up, you don't reach your arm out, it's locked, done. I love it,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely. I mean, the key here is that you can process 1,000 transactions at the same time, because everybody's bringing a pay machine essentially in their pocket. And so, yeah, if your gates are out in the weather and it's pouring down rain, it's irrelevant when you go gateless, because they can do the transaction from the comfort of their car. And that's really the reason we both have the text pay and the camera pay. The camera pay tends to be something that you need to be closer to the signage to do, but the text pay, you can start that transaction, as long as you can see the sign from inside your car. And so It's, again, about trying to create products and channels that customers want to use that frictionlessly provides them access to the facility.
Convenience is key.
Awesome. Now, there's a cost question just around like a ballpark cost for DMV lookups. Is there?
So our model with GlideEye is basically free installation, and the unpaid parking goes to the client. It goes to the parking operation. So there's really no cost to that that's recognized through the P&L. It's basically the partnership that we've got underwrites the equipment and the operation. There's actually significant operation because all of those reads that end up being available to be ticketed actually go and are reviewed by a person before it would proceed to a DMV lookup. So it is a fairly expensive operation, but it's incredibly efficient when you start to compare it in a very, very large facility and we do it on a lot of the facilities that we've got revenue share agreements and leases and things like that on. So from a business standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, but it is not free. That's for sure. It is not free.
Cool. Okay. The next question is, and thank you for that, is there a solution to show how many EV spaces are available? I think that goes to Josh with the single space.
Yeah. So we have a number of different ways of doing it, whether it's a number of EV spaces in a given lane, or whether it's a few EV spaces here or there. So the idea is we have, or there are detection technologies that can be placed simply just for EV spaces. So that way you can see what their dwell time is, what the occupancy of those individual spaces. What's also nice is that with our open API, we're able to share that occupancy data on any number of third-party sites. So right now in charging stations, there's several or 5 or 6 different apps that collect charging information or charging station information. But what we'd be happy to do is share our occupancy with them should they be able to accept it. But nonetheless, on a website or on any other channel, we can share those availability of those small charging spaces.
Great. And now for EV charging stations, is there a limit as to how long a vehicle can sit at the charging station to prevent it from becoming a personal reserve space?
Sensors can be used to set time limits, but I think it's up to the asset owner, operator, person in charge as to what limit do they want, right? You know what I mean? If you have a residential building that has, 3 chargers, but for, 14 EV cars that tenants have, you're going to have to manage that differently than someone who's got 20 chargers that are half used. So it's going to depend on the demand and supply of what's going on in that individual lot.
Great. And now, does the team have experience with gateless facilities at an airport environment with a large mix of users and vehicles from pickup, drop-off, short stay, long stay, employees, buses, shuttle, taxis, limos?
We don't, but we will. No, actually, it's funny. I get asked all the time, what types of properties does Gateless work for? And I say, literally, we're on every single type of real estate vertical you could think of: residential, retail, malls, mixed use, town centers, transit hubs, etc. But we have not done an on-airport. We do some off-airport operations using glide parks. But we have not done on airport, but stay tuned. I do think, again, back to that equation of compliance is driven a lot by the duration of the average stay. And the average stay in transit environments is usually pretty long. And so, especially in those lots and garages where the stay is long, I think Gateless is actually a pretty incredible solution. It's just going to get proven out like anything. People used to say you couldn't do it in a Class A office environment, and I can tell you there's a bunch of Class A office environments that will never, ever install gates again because they'd have a riot on their hands. It's just such a more consistent operation, and when you have a lot of monthlies, it's just such a win.
Yeah, but imagine being a business traveler, though, pulling up to an airport and not have to pull a ticket and go out, right? But in some cases, the gates might feel like a greater security play, but in terms of service, convenience, lack of cost, lack of installation and everything, the gateless would be a huge win up until such point that they achieve an occupancy point maybe where they don't want to let people in, but you just manage that the same way.
Same way as
close off the lane, close off the lanes anyway, put your A-frames there or whatever. Yeah. But it's just a matter of saying is that whether they're going to try it and do it. But to be honest, I imagine all of their parkers would love it.
It'll start with small airports and it'll work its way up, is my guess. Just that's a very it's a slower moving, more conservative typically operation, just because it's very large and they run pretty significant RFP processes. So
yeah, for sure.
Awesome. All right, Ben, I got a question specifically for you. Ben, does your platform have the ability to utilize the enforcement platform to search DMV records nationally? And then the second question to that is, does your platform have a good success rate with a very limited staffing model, or are you relying on full-time staffing?
No, from a staffing standpoint, it's a much more efficient model. Again, you're really just sort of, I sort of believe, and it depends on the facility, but you're checking it maybe once a day, 2 times a day, or 3 times a day, and then you've got this Glide Eye. So what we've done on the Glide Eye is Premium is sort of selling this, but we've actually partnered with a company that manages the process. And I'll tell you, again, I think we obviously are 100% license plate based as a company. And so I spent probably, I guess it's been 4 years now, researching LPR cameras. And I had installed a bunch of different systems in sort of a beta and alpha sort of implementation. And everybody kept talking to me about read rates and read rates and read rates. But ultimately, the read rates are really dictated by the environment. I think, there's definitely some systems that are a little bit better than others. But I was looking for sort of a key differentiator, and the company that we chose to power Glide Eye is a company that has the IP around essentially red light cameras for parking enforcement, i.e., this ability to use a fixed LPR camera and then reconcile with the database, do a DMV lookup, and then mail the citations. And so that was really ultimately the big differentiator when I chose to partner there. It is around that IP related to the mailing of the ticket via the DMV lookup. So I think they see success rates in the 80 to 90% on the lookups is, I believe, where they are. It depends by state, though, and obviously some states it's not possible in.
Awesome. Okay, so now at this point we have one question that's left, and then from there we'll do closing, remarks, statements, just a closing, and then all other questions that weren't answered in this Q&A, I'll follow up with you personally and send you some answers. So we will get to those questions. Now, the last question we have is, are there instances of users fudging their occupancy, paying but underreporting the amount of time that they were in the lot?
Fudging uses of occupancy and they're paying. Could you repeat the question? My apologies.
Sure thing. It's are there instances of users fudging their occupancy, paying but underreporting the amount of time they were in the lot?
So this is more not occupancy. This is more about their dwell time and what they're paying for, and people.
Yeah, I guess it's more of a payment compliance question. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe the person's a little bit more familiar with Glide Parks and asked that question, because we do have actually a crowdsourced occupancy feedback that gives you more of a perception of occupancy, which is an interesting thing to look at and compared to the real occupancy that we get from the parking Logix. But that's just back to that compliance rate. The answer is certainly, yeah, there are people that might pay for an hour and stay for 2, but that would show up in that compliance rate. That's all factored into the compliance rates that we would see at the facility.
Yeah.
Awesome. So with that, I personally want to say thank you to everyone who's joined this webinar, and I'll leave it to Ben and Josh just for closing statements.
Well, on my behalf, obviously, thank you everyone for coming. We'll any questions are unanswered, we'll get back to you. And if you have any questions about Gateless or occupancy systems, our information is made available. And yeah, look, we know how everyone is so busy these days, and there's lots of different webinars, and we're glad that you decided to spend your time with us.
And I just want to thank Josh and the Parking Logix team for putting this together, and then thank everybody who joined us. Hopefully you learned something. One thing I do want to be sure everybody understands is that Premium Parking is both a parking management company and a solutions provider. And so we're very unique in that, and we maybe don't fit into the box that the industry has typically seen. So we sell software, but we also can run full stack operations. And we call Glide Parks a system that's built by operators for operators. So I just sometimes need to clarify that, and I wanted to do that while everybody was listening. But thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.